Okay, so welcome back. We're about to test question 7 of our treatise on prudence. So we're continuing our conversation within the talk of prudence about conscience. All right. So question 6, we talked about what is our conscience? Does everyone have a conscience? And why it's important to form our conscience well. We're going to see that again in this question. This question is a little shorter than some of the other ones, at least the answer to it is. So we'll get right to it. So the question here is, should one always follow one's conscience? Why or why not? So in the last section, we recognized that our conscience can be misformed. It can err in judgment. And the example that we used was the slave owner. The slave owner in the 18th century who sincerely believed in his heart of hearts that owning slaves, owning other human beings, and trading them and using them and misusing them was acceptable, that it was, in fact, a good thing, that it was the order of creation, if you will. Um, they believed that, an African slave was something like an animal, or at least less than human. So, if that's true, and humans have order of all creation, then clearly it's okay to do that. And their conscience was telling them that. That's what their little angel on his shoulder was telling them. Yeah, go ahead. This is a good idea. No objections here. Granted, the devil's probably not tempting him away from it because the devil on his shoulder knows it's the wrong thing. He wants him to do it too. It's like they're both in agreement here. So if we know that our conscience can be misformed, it can err in judgment. So we should only follow our conscience when we're certain it's accurate, right? I mean, we should have absolute certainty that our conscience is accurate before we follow it, right? That should be the answer. No, no. All right, it's Mr. Nedry from Jurassic Park. No. You can't. That doesn't make any sense. All right, ignoring your conscience makes absolutely no sense. All right, because remember, our conscience is our most sincere judgment. It's the angel on our shoulder. It's what we truly believe is right. It's our heart of hearts. It's our gut feeling. So we're always going to pick our conscience, or at least that's going to be our baseline. If we're going away from our conscience, people we're tempted to do something else. But it'd be like, telling someone to go against their conscience, or it's like telling someone to do what he sincerely believed to be not to do what he sincerely believed to be right. Now, when we meet somebody with an erroneous conscience, yes, we work with them. We try to inform their conscience to be better. But to tell them to go against their conscience, that's just it's weird. You just don't do it. It makes no sense. It's like a square triangle. It's like a paradox. You just it's not. You just don't. It doesn't work that way. Okay. But that brings us to a disturbing realization. Okay. So the realization is this, and this is in our journey of moral theology or moral philosophy, even if you want. Um, the disturbing realization is this, that one can follow one's conscience, and in doing so honestly and sincerely, in their heart of hearts, in their gut, really believe that they are acting well, and yet acting so wrongly. Because remember, one of the principal claims of the Christian moral thought is that, is moral realism, that the rightness or the wrongness of an action, the good or the evil of an action, is independent of what we feel and hear, independent of what the angel is telling you on your shoulder. Is independent. It's outside. All right. There are some things that are objectively wrong. I mean, most of us would agree slavery is objectively wrong, and yet our conscience can tell us the opposite. It can be misformed, and we've seen this terribly over the course of human history. And so some just examples. Again, we already talked about slavery. All right. These men on the boat sincerely and honestly believe that what they are doing, that taking these men with darker skins and putting them in chains, and lining them up in boats and putting them, sailing them across an ocean in a journey that will probably kill a good number of them, and then selling them into bondage where they will be whipped and beaten and live lives of servitude. They they have no their conscience has no objection to that. All right, um, and it's so bad that again, this was the 17th, 18th century, 19th century, even midway through the 19th century, we fought a whole war over this. All right, and half of the people fighting that war were fighting to keep this system in place. All right, now were they all consciously in agreement with slavery? Probably not. I'm sure some of the foot soldiers of the Southern cause were, just fighting because just their state pride or something. As stupid as they're, since they're stupid, but as wrong as that is, all right. But obviously, the leaders of the country, or of the rebellion, and some of its generals, sincerely believed that slavery was okay, that it was worth fighting a war over. All right, and that's what the Civil War was about. It wasn't about states' rights. It wasn't about, the Southern cause. The glory. It was not a glorious cause. It was a war to keep people in bondage, and from the North, it was a war to set other men free. All right. I mean, it sounds. That's what the Civil War was about. And so, obviously, hundreds of thousands died in that war, fighting that out. And again, look at Hitler. Hitler, and it convinced a whole country that it was a good idea to murder 6 million Jews and a number of gypsies, homosexuals, and other undesirables, including some Catholics, by the way. Many Catholic priests and heroic lay people were murdered during that time. Why? Because it was the better thing to do. It was good for the Aryan race to manage the world. All right, it was good. That goes down back to philosophy with Nietzsche and the Ubermensch and the sheep, and the German people believed they were the Supermen, the Ubermensch, and that's what Hitler had convinced them of. All right, he had some amazing gifts. He was an amazing speaker. His rhetorical skills were beyond compare. And so he had that gift to convince people to move their consciences, all right, to inform their consciousness. And obviously he did it very, very badly. And so that's why it's so important. And this goes back to ancient philosophy. Remember our friend Plato in his Socratic dialogue is a dialogue called the Gorgias, where he talks about rhetoric and how rhetoric is just a tool. And it's just because you can be rhetorical about something doesn't make it right. And that's why I say to you guys, you Hendricken men out there, I always say Hendricken men change the world. And many of you have this great gift, the same gift that Hitler had of rhetoric, of being able to stand in front of a group of people and talk to them and convince them of something, anything. And so it's important. That's why our formation of our conscience is so important. And so that when we convince people of things, we're convincing them of good things and not serious evils like happened in Nazi Germany in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. All right. But even in modern times, we still have this problem. This is a tweet from CBS News back in 2017. That's so what, 3 years ago? Not a little over three, almost 4 years ago. August, so three and a half years ago. But I remember when this tweet came out. It says that Iceland is on pace to virtually eliminate Down syndrome through abortion. All right. So these people in Iceland, I'm not saying every single person in Iceland, but apparently a large number of people in Iceland, people who are in charge of things, of medical practices, believe that it's a good idea to abort any child that has Down syndrome and thus cure the country of Down syndrome. All right. Most people, even pro-choicers, think this is insane. This is abhorrent. All right. But these people believe it and they do it. Their consciences are so unformed. And not to go down the rabbit hole of abortion, we're going to hit that next semester. But that's a difference. That's a key thing in the pro-choice position. And the pro-lifers for the most part are pro-life. But pro-choicers, you have a split. You have a split. There are some pro-choicers who follow their conscience that are misinformed, and their conscience is telling them that this is not a child in the womb, this is not a the fetus is not a human person, so therefore it's important for women's rights to allow for an abortion. And obviously, I disagree with those people sincerely, but I understand where they're coming from. In fact, if my conscience told me that, yeah, that's not a child, that's not a human person in there, yeah, okay, then yeah, so a woman should be able to have that non-person taken out. Um, but the other pro-choicers who are, personally pro-life, so their conscience is telling them, this is a child, like you should not murder it. And yet they say, but publicly or politically or however they justify it, I'm pro-choice. I'm going to vote pro-choice. I'm going to support Planned Parenthood. I'm going to do whatever. Um, that's not a misformed conscience. That's a sincere evil of going against your conscience, going against what you know to be right. That's listening to the devil and falling into temptation. So it's interesting. We'll talk more about that when we talk about abortion next semester. But that's a good example of a difference between someone with a misformed conscience and someone who's just going against their conscience. All right. And both are not good things. All right. Finally, another final example. These 19 men, all right, they hijacked those 4 planes you can see on the left, the 2 American airline planes, 2 United Airlines planes, and they committed the atrocities of 9/11. All right, uh, 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center on 9/11 around 9 o'clock in the morning. Another plane flew into the Pentagon down on the bottom right. And then United 93 crash landed in Pennsylvania because the heroic passengers overcame those men who hijacked it and crashed the plane before they could crash it into either the White House or the Capitol. They don't know, as far as I know, they don't know which one they were going for. But my point to all this is that those 19 men who hijacked those planes sincerely and honestly believed they were doing the right thing. They were so convinced, all right, by their conscience was so convinced by um, their faith, really. You can debate whether or not it's the true Muslim faith, but basically their version, let's call it that, their version of the Muslim faith warp their conscience into believing that murdering all these people, something like 2 or 3,000 people that day, in downtown New York City and in the Pentagon, and then the number of passengers on Flight 93, that would justify, that was a good thing. The infidels needed to die. However they justified it, but they believed they were doing a good thing, and obviously they weren't. And so their consciences were severely misformed. And so that's why the formation of our conscience is of the utmost importance. It's so important. As I just showed you, there are many instances in world history where the misform of a conscience results in terrible atrocities in the world. But even outside the big pictures, things like that, even in the little things we do every day, a misformed conscience can lead us down the wrong road that not only brings us into a bad situation, but harms other people. And we want to avoid that. And why is it important? Because you have to follow your conscience. I already said how ridiculous it is to not follow your conscience. All right. I'm not talking about being tempted away from your conscience, but like looking at it and being, yeah, that's not the right thing to do. It just doesn't make sense. All right. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us this, reminds us of this. A human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. If he were to deliberately act against it, he would condemn himself. Yet it can happen that the moral conscience remains in ignorance and makes erroneous judgments about acts to be performed or already committed. Right, from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Article 1790. So you have to follow your conscience. It's just that's the moral thing. And so the Christian tradition has maintained this. They've maintained this since the beginning, that we always follow our conscience because we trust that people generally do indeed know what is right and wrong. We talked about that last question at the very beginning, when we're talking about what is conscience. There's an upper level idea of what is right and wrong that we tend to know. All right. And so the answer too is, if you feel uncomfortable about doing something that you think your conscience is telling you to do, y- I'm not trying again, not be tempted away, not the devil kind of whispering, no, I think you'd rather do this. This is more fun. I know that's the right thing to do, but it's more fun to be bad. We're not talking that. But if you honestly think your conscience is telling you to do something wrong, that's not your conscience. Again, that's the devil. Because your conscience, again, that's your conscience telling you that what you want to do is wrong. Right? It's kind of, you gotta get your mind around that. But your conscience will never tell you to do something that you think is wrong. That's important because your conscience is the faculty by which you know things are right or wrong. So that's why you always have to follow your conscience. Right? Those slave owners had to follow their conscience. Right? They really believed that this is the right thing to own slaves, and so they had to do it. It would be almost in a weird way wrong thing not to do it. And that's something that the Cooley's going to talk about next question. All right. I know it's kind of a mind-boggling thing, especially when we look in the past and we see such atrocities of the past, and how could anyone ever believe that was a good idea? But they did. And as I said, with abortion and some other things, we still do. All right. So the traditional term for this is an erroneous conscience, a conscience that leads us down the wrong path. All right. It's a person who acts wrongly but doesn't know any better. Okay. We honestly think we're acting rightly. That's what it means to have an erroneous conscience. All right. Um, so the question becomes now, if a person's required to follow your conscience, all right, which we are, the catechism tells us that, and just kind of common sense tells us that, all right, and our conscience can be erroneous, and say in this situation is erroneous, and thus it causes this person to commit an evil act, is that person blameworthy for doing it? So let that blow your mind for a minute. Let you think about that. And when we come back, Mr. Cooley is going to answer question 8, which is one blameworthy for following an erroneous conscience?